Tomorrow nerds! This week on the LarpHouse, we are starting a mini-series, so get out your sewing machines because we are starting with Sewing 101, the Pompous Prince Cape. I have brought in special guests Courtney and Caitlin of Different Places Designs. For more information or commissions, Courtney can be found at Potterly_designs on Instagram, or you can just go to the Different Places Designs Facebook page. We are going to cover some basic stitches, the anatomy of a sewing machine, and how to make a basic traveling cape. So, without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Caitlin.
Hi, I'm Caitlin from Different Places Designs, and today we're going to talk about the basics of sewing and what the heck that means. So sewing is a really weird animal, and the first time that I sewed anything, I went into a fabric store and I picked up a pattern and I realized I had no idea what I was doing. But thanks to the lovely people at the sewing store that I went to and a single class and a wealth of knowledge online, I was able to actually get to a really professional level of sewing, so now that I can confidently make my own garments, and I promise so can you. The basics that we're going to talk about are how to measure yourself so you know the amount of fabric to buy, because that's kind of important. Some sewing basics so you know what your sewing machine does and what to do with those things. And then we're also going to talk about, specifically here, how to make a cloak. We're going to make two different types, a gathered cloak and then a more fitted cloak, both of which are for a very recognizable prince. But either way, those are skills that you can take on and do a lot with, and it's going to create a really good foundation for when you make your own LARP costumes. This is a really good basic model of a sewing machine, and this has all the things that you want it to do. So you have your lower bobbin thread, and that comes on a little spool like this, little spoolie dude. And this thread hooks with and creates like a hook with the upper thread, and that comes from this spot up here, and this is also how you load your bobbin. If you go like this and then you hit the pedal, it makes just this spin. If you go like this and you hit the pedal, it makes this go up and down. Some models, no matter what you do, the needle will go up and down, but that's another story. So the basics that you need to know about sewing are the types of stitches and then what a seam allowance is. If you know what those two things are, then you can sew pretty much anything with the sewing machine. There are these teeny little marks on your sewing machine where the foot comes down, and these are your seam allowance guides. Seam allowance is the part of a hem between the edge of the fabric and then where the seam is. Usually standard is 5/8 of an inch, but if you do 1/2 inch, most of the time a pattern will come up. Some sewing machines will have a guide with the inches, but if you're ever curious about what that is, you can just go from where your needle drops down over 5/8 and you can find where that is. So the next thing we're going to talk about is your stitch basics. You really only need two different types of stitches to make basically any garment. The first one is your basic straight stitch. The way that you can use this in different situations is for putting together garments, but that's when like your stitch length comes into play. So the shorter the stitch length, the more securely it's going to hold the garment and the fabric together. The longer the stitch length, the more temporary that is. If you ever see on a pattern and it says basting, that's what this refers to, is making the stitch length as long as possible so that it's easier to cut out later or so that it's easier to sew over without making a seam fold weirdly. The length also comes into play if you use your zigzag stitch. Zigzag stitches are great for things that you want to have flex or things that you want to be able to bend or move. The next part about this specifically is stitch width, which you can even see here on the machine, is if it's a really narrow zigzag back and forth or a really wide one. If it's a long stitch with a wide width, it's going to be a really big crisscross. If it's a short length with a short width on a crisscross, it's actually going to create what's called a satin stitch, and that's really good for going over holes or if you tear something. It's like embroidering almost, so it will completely cover whatever it is that you're trying to merge together. For the most part, you won't need to adjust tension too much. If you find that your thread is snapping or that it's getting caught in the bobbin, that's when you'd mess with tension, but don't do that unless you're actually looking at your sewing machine manual. The sewing machine manuals are basically Bibles on how to do anything. When you start to sew, one thing that you want to do when you are doing your first few stitches is you want to do like 2 or 3 stitches and then hit this. You hold that down, you press the foot again, and then it will actually make it sew backwards. So it creates a stitch one way and then a stitch back So that way it locks it. So once you release that, it will go forward again, and that creates a nice lock so you don't have to tie a knot or anything. So the basics of measuring so that when you read a pattern back, you know exactly what you're looking at are bust, and you actually want to go widest part of your bust, waist, and hips. Those are usually the things that you need to know. When it comes to things like arm circumference or those parts of your body where you just feel like you're weirdly shaped, patterns don't know how to handle that, and so you have to adjust it for them because they are not omnipotent beings. You have to make it work yourself. One thing that I'm going to tell everyone, especially women out there, when you go to do women's patterns, I once made a dress for a friend of mine where per the pattern, she measured at a size 12. Girl's not a 12. She's a stick, and she's measuring at a size 12. When we cut that out and we made it for her, we actually had to cut excess fabric off when we were tailoring. That is never a problem. That is what you want to do, because if you measure and you think, oh, no, I can make a smaller size, and then you can't put a zipper in, you can't add a closure, you have these open seams that can't close in the back, that's always a problem. So always err to the larger side of things, especially when you're measuring and looking at a pattern, because otherwise it's not going to be a good time. For guys, what you want to do is you want to measure the width of your chest, because otherwise your shirt's not going to fit right. It usually calls for a shoulder measurement and then your waist again. Men's and women's clothing is cut very, very differently. So whatever it is that you are making, you do want to account for what those measurements are, because they're not just there to make you go, oh my God, I'm measuring at this. It's so that you know what size you're making. So if you're doing basic measurements on the bust, you actually want to go from the widest part. I always make my clients feel awkward when I go, you want to go from your nips all the way around. So you want to go from that level. The waist is the narrowest part of you. So on me, that's where the top of my skirt is. On Stephanie here, it's right there. And then hips are a little lower. There is like an industry standard of how far below they define your waist to your hips. You can measure from that point, though I usually go just from the widest part of my hips. Whatever you feel comfortable measuring, that's where you want to go from. You know how you wear clothes. One final note that I'm going to say, when you go to measure yourself and when you go to read a pattern back, humans were not meant to wear clothes. We are meant to run around naked. This is a socialized construct. So if you ever feel like, wow, this isn't going to fit me right, this fits me funky, you made it to the measurements and it doesn't work, don't stress. For this project, since we don't necessarily need a pattern for it, we're just going to go based on shoulder measurement. And we're going to use Stephanie here as our example. But let's say you want a cloak that has a really nice drape to it. You want to take your complete shoulder circumference to where you want the cloak to sit, and usually double that. That'll add a nice gather around the collar so that it looks like a nice full flowing cape for the least amount of cutting. And we'll talk about different ways to cut a pattern in a few minutes. For Stephanie here, we probably want to sit from collarbone to collarbone. So we're gonna go around like this to about the other side. So for Stephanie here, it's about 34 inches. We can round that up to 35 because that'll make it a little easier for us to then remember that measurement. 70 inches doubled. So it's going to be a total of 70 inches around her shoulders so that it's a nice full draping cape. This is sewing day 2, and we have our fabric. We got this wonderful 60-inch velvet fabric that is the exact right length, so we don't have to cut it. We can just work with the width as it is. We got enough of it so that we can just sort of cut this in half and work half and half. Because the cape that we're making is 2 different lengths, we're going to have a shorter cape that's a half circlet, and then one that is gathered that is worn underneath that behind the shoulders. The nice thing about the fabric that we got is we're going to be able to just cut this in half and then gather it up, and that's our gathered cape, and then make a circle cape with the other one. But if you're not lucky enough to do that, if you only have a 45-inch fabric, what you can do is measure from shoulder to shoulder and just about double that number, round it up to an even number, just so it's easy to remember. Go get about double that in length, actually, if you can only get a 45-inch fabric, and that way you have a lot of fabric to work with. So we have sewn the lining to the exterior of the gathered part of our cape. What's wonderful about this is you just need to cut a square and then cut another square and then sew them together. I've left the top seam open so that we can do understitching. Understitching is something that a lot of people won't do when they are sewing, but I think more people should. So understitching is basically just sewing down your hem, your seam allowance here, to the lining fabric. That makes sure that this lies down so it's not going to bunch up, it's not going to create a weird seam. It's going to lie nice and flat, and make sure that even if you did toss this through the wash, it's not going to do anything. And you just do a secondary seam right next to the first one to tack everything down.
So this is basically the pattern of the capelet. You want to cut it out on the fold so that when it opens it is a full circle. I made sure to measure about 17.5 inches all the way so I could get a nice even circle all the way across. If it's just a normal capelet, you just want to slice it up the top right here so that it'll open and you'll have a front. Because Prince Phillip's has this nice swooping, I went ahead and brought the opening down this way. And then of course you want to take the circumference of the neck and figure out the radius so you can get a nice tiny little circle up here. So this is the exact same size as the folded piece of fabric that I just showed you. This is the outside, that was the lining. When I pin these together, they're going to match up perfectly, and then I'll sew them all along the edges so that when I fold it inside out, or right side out, it will have really clean edges and a beautiful lining. So these are the pieces for the collar. I have cut out 2 pieces of the velvet and a piece of fusible interfacing, which needs to be ironed onto one of the pieces of velvet. Therefore, it adheres to it and will become very, very stiff. And then all 3 layers will be sewn together along the outside, turned right side out, and then I will sew it to the cape along the center here. So this is the capelet. Once it's been all cut out and is down a human form, you can see the lovely curve here that I cut in. I'll be attaching the rest of the cape to the neckline back here, and then I'll be sewing the lining along the edges, and I'll flip it inside out using the neckline so that it's very beautiful and pristine and there's no seams. Here's what the collar is going to look like once it's attached. I chose to line it with velvet instead of what we'll be lining the rest of it with because it turns out, and so I wanted to make sure that it has a consistent look from the collar down all the way. I'm going to be interfacing it with a very, very stiff interfacing so that this will definitely hold its shape of that nice kind of regal outburst. And then of course our lovely little clasp right here. So this is the main cape. I'm going to be sewing it to the capelet along the collar, and I'll be hiding all of this fabric in the collar seam itself. I am pretty terrible about not pinning things together when I sew, but you should, especially when you have a fabric like this velvet that is very slippery and doesn't want to adhere to itself. That way, as you're sewing, you can make sure that all the layers are even, they haven't moved anywhere weird. The only thing is that make sure you are taking the pins out before you actually get to the needle on the sewing machine, or else you risk breaking your needle, which is something that I've done a lot. Collar is pinned together, all 3 layers. The seam allowance is going to be 1/4 of an inch, which is what your seam allowance should always be for enclosed seams. When it comes to sewing like sleeves into armholes or side seams, any kind of thing like that, you usually use 1/2 inch. That way the fabric has the strength to withhold your body. But anytime you have an enclosed seam like the top of this collar, you definitely want to use 1/4 of an inch. Also, at the beginning and end of every seam, make sure you backstitch first and last to ensure that the seams don't come apart, come open. So, backstitch and forward. Hi. Snip. Snip. Anytime you're turning corners, you definitely want to cut the excess fabric off, or Also be nice and bulky in the inside, and it won't form a proper like corner. Like to use my scissors to help point it. Be careful though, sometimes your scissors can go through the fabric, and then you have to start over. Thank you. So here's the collar. Now to make sure that everything lies flush, we're going to do some top stitching. And there's the collar.
So what we have here is the gathered cape sewed to an ungathered piece of fabric, and that is because we didn't want to sew the gathered bit up into the neckline, because that might have made the neckline pretty tight for the person who was going to be wearing it. So we just made it a little bit simpler for ourselves. So there you have it, nerds. Now you have a cape worthy of princely activities such as, I don't know, what's a basic bitch prince thing? Saving people? Riding horses to nowhere? Looking for girls wandering around in the forest? Anyway, yeah, top stitching and understitching. Super important. Makes things look really great. Who knew? So, as you can see, Caitlin and Courtney really know their stuff, and again, they do take commissions. So, Courtney, once again, can be found at Potterly_designs, and you can contact them both at Different Places Designs on Facebook. If you like what you see on our show and you want to see more, please consider making a pledge to us on our Patreon page, because we do need money to do the science, and that would actually be really cool of you. I also give personal video responses to questions from people who pledge a little bit more. Or you can mosey on down to our Etsy store if you like handmade props and prosthetics. If you have any questions, comments, emotional outbursts, please feel free to message us. We are on Twitter, Tumblr, Facebook, and Instagram. Also, don't forget to submit your in-character interviews for our Meet the Characters Global Edition video. We are waiting on you guys, but don't worry, if you are waiting on that one last piece to make your costume perfect, you can unclench your butt cheeks. We don't have a hard deadline for this, so make it right, but send it over because we're super excited to see it. Guidelines for submissions and the interview questions can be found in the description below. So, as always, nerds, like us, subscribe to us, vote with us.